How can you be a criminal defense lawyer? I tell you that I've been doing this since 2002, and I can't tell you how many times I've been asked that question. And of course, a lot of other of my friends and colleagues that do criminal defense work are often asked the same question. How can you defend people accused of crimes or even criminals? And I'm going to take you back to the Boston Massacre and talk about how that shaped American trials and the rights of the accused and a hero that came forth from that moment. So let's go back to the 1760s. At that time, of course, America had some colonies, and one of the colonies was in and around Boston, now Massachusetts. And at the time, there were British soldiers that were called redcoats because they wore red coats. And in the late 1760s, Britain had finished a 7-year war with France, and it costed Britain a whole lot of money. So Britain wanted to impose duties or taxes on goods, and they started to try to tax the American colonists called the Townshend Acts. And they wanted them to pay for a bunch of different goods. And of course, these colonists who had broken away from England certainly didn't want to be paying taxes over to England. So there was a lot of friction between these colonists here and the British soldiers that were over here who were sent to, among other things, collect taxes from the American colonists. So tensions between these soldiers and these colonists began to rise, and in late February, a boy was killed, and there were about 2,000 colonists that showed up for his funeral, and that even sparked tensions more. And then we get to March 5th of 1770, and this is where things blew up. So there was a wig maker's apprentice. People wore a lot of wigs back then, and there was an apprentice who was a young man, and he worked in a colonist shop, and he accused a British officer in that military of not paying the bill, which was a huge insult at the time. And it turns out that British officer did, in fact, pay the bill. So he was wrongfully accused of that. But nonetheless, one of the other British soldiers heard about this, and they used to use muskets, which is a type of gun, and he took the butt end, where you put it against your shoulder, of his musket, and he hit the kid right in the face with it. Kid fell down on the ground, and he started crying in pain. And this was not so this is a full-grown man against a kid. Well, grown men who were these colonists around saw this, including some members of Sam Adams' team, and they armed themselves with clubs, and they started to arrive in this area in Boston, and they were really angry about it. And they started to taunt this British officer who hit this kid with the musket. And then they rang church bells, and when they rang church bells back then, it meant that there was a fire in the town. So a whole bunch of other men, because it was all volunteer firefighters at the time, came into the town thinking that there was a fire, and then they found out this was all about this British officer who hit this kid. And they started to surround him and some other British soldiers that were around him, and they started to throw things, anything they could get their hands on, rocks, seashells, believe it or not, big chunks of ice. It was March in Boston, and some other things, anything that they could throw. And they started to pelt these British military with it. Well, as a result, more troops were sent in to protect these British officers, a few more of them. But it was still about 400 angry colonists surrounding these British officers to just a handful of British soldiers. And at one point, one of the British soldiers gets knocked over, and then he gets clubbed in the head. And as a result of that, he picks his gun up and he fires it into the crowd, and he killed someone. And then 30 to 60 seconds later, some more British soldiers fired as they're continuing to be surrounded by this really angry mob. And at the end of when all of that happened, by the way, these people were yelling things at them like, "Damn you sons of you-know-what. You can't," and then they were saying, "You can't kill us all." They were taunting them, fire at us, you can't possibly kill us all. So this was the pressures that these British soldiers were under. At the end of it, 5 colonists were killed and a few more were wounded. And the crowd got really, really angry about this, as you can imagine. And they started to tell the story just the way they wanted to tell the story about it, maybe leaving out some of the taunting, maybe leaving out some of the daring, maybe even leaving out that they were throwing things at these British soldiers. And word spread quick that it was all the British soldiers' fault in this instance. And Paul Revere actually made a very famous drawing of the situation that you can look up, and it shows these redcoats firing on the crowd, right? On what it looked like to be a defenseless crowd. So the crowd was really angry about this, and they pretty much wanted these soldiers lynched, okay? But to calm the crowd down, the governor of that colony at the time promised an investigation, and he urged this crowd to just calm down, let me investigate this. Well, within 2 days, arrest warrants were put out, and then these 8 soldiers and their captain, along with 4 different civilians, were indicted and charged with murder. So one of the things that they did that started to shape American law was knowing that things were at a fever pitch in Boston around this stuff. They waited and postponed the trials until later in the fall so that some tensions could cool down. And the colonists also didn't want the Brits to retaliate, so they agreed to give these people a fair trial, whatever that meant. So much so that this relieved the captain of that British group of soldiers, and he wrote a letter to the Boston newspaper early while he was imprisoned waiting for this trial to happen, thanking Bostonians for choosing a fair trial over mob rule. And some of the colonists definitely did not want to give him a fair trial at all, or any of these British soldiers. And so by now there was a media firestorm on this situation, and news articles and public squares where they used to talk about all these things. It kept firing the crowd up. And so you can imagine for a minute trying to find a lawyer, a colonist lawyer, to represent these damn redcoats, right? They were loath to represent the British, and they knew that they would be risking their careers if they did so, because who, after all, would want to represent the most hated people in that colony, these redcoats that are over here at the order of the king or queen from England, and nobody liked them, right? And then on top of that, they beat up a young boy at one point, and they killed a whole bunch of people in a crowd. So at one point, a guy comes to the doorstep of John Adams. John Adams was a lawyer who represented people in criminal cases, but some other types of law as well. And he had done that, and he was also involved in politics at the time. And so one customer that had him found not guilty in an alleged sex assault case had thanked him, and he had been exonerated for defending that person, and said, God bless his soul, I am not to be hanged, which would have been the punishment at the time. So it was not out of the ordinary when someone came to John Adams' step, because he was a reputable lawyer, when they came to his stairs and said, listen, will you represent these British soldiers and this captain of this British group of soldiers? And Adams said, with tears streaming down his eyes, he said, I am come with a very solemn message from a very unfortunate man. This is how the guy approached John Adams. He wishes for counsel, and I can get none for him, meaning they could not find a lawyer to represent these British soldiers. 2 other first-class lawyers in the area agreed to represent these people, but only if Adams would head up the defense for these people. So Adams delivered a speech about it later, and when he was reflecting on being asked to do this work, which was very unpopular, as you can imagine. I had no hesitation in answering that counsel ought to be the very last thing that an accused person should want in a free country, that the bar ought, in my opinion, to be independent and impartial at all times and in every circumstance, and that persons whose lives were at stake ought to have the counsel they preferred. But he must be sensible that this would be as an important a cause as ever was tried in any court or country of the world, and that every lawyer must hold himself responsible not only to his country, but to the highest and most infallible of all tribunals for the part he should act. And that's a famous quote that Adams put out about this. So imagine the pressure that John Adams was facing in this colony. Remember, these cities aren't as big as they were as they are nowadays. He was taking on the defense of the very people that the mob in the town had hated, and the glaring looks he would get by agreeing to represent them, the threats that he and his family would receive for agreeing to defend these people, the silent treatment he'd get at any business he would walk into, perhaps his church, perhaps the neighborhood pub, or anywhere else, the political risk he'd be taking to his coming political career that he was going to engage in. And finally, the very real damage to his law practice. He'd lose some of his clients that he already had, and some others would refuse to hire him in the future. So this act of high-minded professionalism did not endear Adams to every Boston patriot. In fact, one of the other defense lawyers that was on the team was shamed by his own father for doing it. Yet, on June 6th, later that time, John Adams was overwhelmingly elected to an official political post. And so it did work out well for him in the end. But in the opinion of the Boston mob, the best resolution of the cases would be immediate hangings for these soldiers and an instant trial conducted while the town was still whipped into a frenzy. But the governor said, nope, we're going to postpone this, as I've said, until the autumn. So the British officers were worried that John Adams and his defense team would not win against these very long odds. The view was prevalent that innocent blood had been shed, meaning some of these people in the crowd, the revolutionaries, and that somebody ought to be hanged for it. That was the sentiment in the town. But some new things came as a result of these trials. The first thing was that the jurors were sequestered, meaning kept apart from their family and friends. That hadn't been done in an American trial to that date. And it's something that once in a while happens in trials still today, back because of that case setting the precedent for it. And that even though the captain of that British military group had only drawn his sword and not shot into the crowd, he was charged with murder because he was the officer in charge and responsible for the soldiers under him. And so what happened was John Adams quoted something that was very precedential even from English times in the trials over there. And what he said is, it's better for 5 guilty people to escape unpunished than 1 innocent person that should die. And he began his opening argument with that, quoting that. He also explained that the law as it bore on mob actions, and he reminded the jury of Blackstone's view of self-defense, and that it's the primary canon of the law of nature. So, although defending the captain was tough in its own right, and he got him found not guilty, John Adams faced even a bigger task in defending the accused soldiers. And one of the things they got to do was that no Boston resident was allowed on the jury because of the prejudice and the pretrial prejudice news and so forth in the town. It was going to be hard to find a fair juror that was actually from the town of Boston. So no Bostonian was allowed on the jury, which now we would typically regard as a change of venue or a strike for cause in today's law. But it dates way back to that. And of course, they had to prove self-defense. And so Adams had another famous quote: "If by supporting the rights of mankind and of invincible truth, I shall contribute to save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance, equally fatal, his blessings and years of transport will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind." What does that mean? In other words, Adams indicated that he believed it was essential to protect innocence. And even if he, as a lawyer, suffered because of it, and even if a guilty man or men went free, Adams felt it was better to have protected innocent men and err on that side, which now we talk about as the presumption of innocence and what that really means. He thought that if anybody was to blame, it was the British government that stationed the troop in Boston and put these soldiers in this position, not the soldiers themselves. Moreover, part of this tragedy came from the conduct of the colonial mob, and nobody was telling that side of the story, of course. So Adams is attributed to another very important quote from that trial, and he said, "Facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes or our inclinations or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." As someone sympathetic to the patriot cause, Adams acknowledged that the wishes of the patriot might be for the British officers to suffer, but he believed that the facts indicated that the 8 soldiers were actually innocent. What happened? Well, the jury acquitted, meaning found not guilty, 6 of the soldiers, and found 2 of the soldiers guilty of a lesser charge of manslaughter. So get this, way back then in the 1770s, they had a special rule if you were convicted of something called benefit of the clergy. And what that meant is if you were a first-time offender, rather than being put in prison for life or put to death, you could be branded with an M near your thumb on your hand over here, the letter M, and that would mean that if you ever had to testify in court in a future legal proceeding, people would see the M and known that you had been given a break and been found guilty once before. So maybe they could doubt your testimony going forward. So after the decision of the trial, the people in the newspapers, and particularly the Boston Gazette, they railed on John Adams for defending these people. And he also said that after that, he lost half of his practice due to his defense of these British captain and soldiers. And his practice definitely did suffer. But the venom remained in words only because there were no riots after those October and December trials. So this trial and this work that John Adams did had a deep significance in our legal system today, and it's a testament to, back then, the colonial legal system. Through the trials of these hated British soldiers, and even amidst a city that believed that they were all guilty and that, frankly, they ought to just be hanged and have a quick trial and be done with it, that Massachusetts colony at the time showed that it desired colonies to be a nation of laws rather than arbitrary power, and even if that meant that extremely disliked British troops received a fair trial, and even in a town where mob rule had seized the day on March 5th, this mob rule did not have to seize the day by the time the trials came around. In addition, this trial left us with some things we still have today in our cases, which is the custom of innocent until proven guilty. And John Adams said it is more important to the community that innocence should be protected than it is that guilt should be punished. So he led the way as a lawyer that defended the unpopular side, asserting that no unfortunate individual should die due to tyranny, and he was willing to risk contempt of his own fellow patriots and his law practice to live by this value. Moreover, this trial put out their self-defense, a canon in the law of nature, and was the first time the phrase reasonable doubt was used in an American courtroom. So these are all some of the customs and values that we take for granted in the modern world, but they have a basis in John Adams' defense of these British redcoats at the time. John Adams affirmed the importance of the law of emotion through his defense. Here's what he said about that. The law in all vicissitudes of government, fluctuations of the passions, or flights of enthusiasm will preserve a steady, undeviating course. It will not bend to uncertain wishes, imaginations, or wanton tempers of men. In other words, it was essential to him to hold maintaining law above human beings because that is the only way these people would receive a fair trial. And then we get to the third anniversary in March 5, 1773, right around the time of the Boston Tea Party. Adams reflected back 3 years earlier on his decision to accept the responsibility of defending these British soldiers and the risk that he, along with his family, faced when he decided to do it. And he said, "I devoted myself to endless labor and anxiety, if not to infamy and death, and that for nothing except what was indeed was and ought to be in all a sense of duty." Just like his wife believed that firmly the right thing to do was to defend the British for a fair trial, and even if that meant that his family suffered as a result. So while he was glad to serve his town and later his country in this way of defending the right to a fair trial, he did not take specific pride in the fact that he was the one to do it. In fact, he suggested that any lawyer at the time had a sense of duty and should have done it. He said the judgment of death against those soldiers would have been as foul a stain upon the country as the executions of the Quakers or witches anciently. As the evidence was, the verdict of the jury was exactly right. So he later declared that he took in the defense of the captain and the soldiers anxiety enough. And it was, however, one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I've ever rendered for my country. Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been a foul stain upon this country. So that meant a lot to him. He felt that that was a true honor and his obligation as a lawyer to defend the hated and the damned, despite what the mob rule was and despite even how that might hurt his own law practice or put he or his family into danger. In sum, this trial back in December of 1770 was a trial that was an important test in the rule of law. This involved that America was going to be a nation of laws, of innocence until proven guilty, and the right to self-defense, no matter how liked or hated the defendant was. Everybody was going to be equal under the law. And so John Adams went along to become our nation's second president. And in doing this case, he displayed immense courage by defending the British soldiers, prioritizing the rule of law over intense public outrage. And as a dedicated patriot, he risked his career, his reputation, and his family's safety to ensure a fair trial, ultimately proving the soldiers acted in self-defense against that mob. So America's defense lawyers, even today, stand ready to defend the damned and the hated and the misjudged. John Adams didn't agree with the British soldiers' cause. Quite the contrary. He didn't agree with what they were doing there. But he believed very deeply in their right to a fair trial and against the mob rule. And he stood up in the face of that adversity. And he showed us in that moment what it meant to be an American, and I think what it meant to be a lawyer. What John Adams did was a tremendous act of service to our country and to our legal profession. But I know it's not for everyone. And I got a question for you. Would you have defended the British soldiers like John Adams did if you were a lawyer back in that time? Why or why not? And did the British soldiers deserve a fair trial while they were on foreign land? Why or why not? And if they didn't deserve a fair trial, why wouldn't they? And the last question I have is people will ask lawyers, well, how can you defend people accused of a crime? And my question is, do we need people who will do that? Is that something that we still value in today in our republic, in our democracy, and in our legal system? Because there are times, as you know, where lawyers will take on controversial causes, and the question becomes, how can you do that, or why do you do that? And we tend to judge them by who they defend. But isn't it important, or don't you think it's important, that we do that to uphold the fabric of our Constitution and the rights that we recognize that every person has here if they're accused of a crime? Let me know what you think, and thanks for listening.